For decades, one man's name was synonymous with unimaginable wealth in Latin America: Carlos Slim, the Mexican business magnate who once held the title of the richest person on earth. His empire stretched across telecommunications, finance, retail, construction, and more, the web of over 200 companies, making him almost untouchable. In Mexico, you couldn't make a phone call, buy a soda, or even rent a car without putting money in Carlos Slim's pocket. But with power comes scrutiny, and in Slim's case, scrutiny turned into open fire when accusations of monopoly began to surface. His crown jewel, América Móvil, parent company of Telmex and Telcel, was accused of dominating the telecom market so aggressively that competitors were crushed before they had a chance to breathe. Consumer advocates claimed that his companies charged some of the highest fees in the world for phone and internet services, slowing Mexico's technological progress while enriching one man to an almost absurd degree. The criticism wasn't just whispers in backrooms, it came from politicians, global watchdogs, and even fellow billionaires. The Mexican government eventually stepped in with sweeping reforms aimed directly at Slim's business. Overnight, the empire that had seemed unshakable was staring down heavy regulations, billions in fines, and the threat of losing its stranglehold on the market. But the monopoly allegations were just one chapter in a bigger, more complex story. Behind the headlines was a man who had built his fortune through sharp instincts, cold calculations, and an almost obsessive eye for undervalued assets. To his defenders, Slim was a self-made genius who transformed Mexico's economy and created millions of jobs. To his critics, he was the embodiment of unchecked capitalism, a man whose control over vital services kept an entire nation paying more for less. And yet, Carlos Slim never seemed rattled in public. No fiery interviews, no emotional outbursts, just the calm smile of a man who has seen the game from the top for far too long to be easily shaken. But behind that calm exterior, the monopoly battle was not just about profits, it was about legacy. If the regulators succeeded, Slim wouldn't just lose market share, he could lose the aura of invincibility that had defined him for decades. How does a man who's built his fortune on control react when the rules suddenly change? When the market is no longer his to dominate? And when the public, the very people who once saw him as a symbol of Mexican pride, start questioning if he's been bleeding them dry all along? They once stood at the very top, but what happened next? Join the Hidden Billionaires to uncover their story. Carlos Slim Hell's story begins far from the glittering towers of corporate Mexico. He was born on the 28th of January, 1940, in Mexico City, to parents who knew both hardship and opportunity. His father, Julian Slim Haddad, had emigrated from Lebanon as a teenager, fleeing the chaos of the Ottoman Empire. Arriving in Mexico with almost nothing, Julian started small, selling goods and managing a dry goods store in the bustling downtown. But what he lacked in wealth, he made up for in relentless business discipline, keeping meticulous records, investing profits wisely, and teaching his children the same values. From a young age, Carlos absorbed these lessons like oxygen. While other children spent their Sundays playing in the park, he was learning to read financial statements and understanding the difference between assets and liabilities. His father gave him a notebook to track expenses and profits, a small but symbolic tool that Slim would later credit as shaping his lifelong obsession with numbers. Tragedy struck early. At just 13 years old, Slim lost his father, leaving a void that could have sent many boys into despair. But instead, Carlos doubled down on the very principles his father had instilled. He began investing his pocket money into government savings bonds and later into shares of the Bank of Mexico. By the time most teenagers were still figuring out what they wanted to be, Slim was already building a small but growing investment portfolio. His mother, Linda Helby, played a quieter but equally important role. Coming from a Lebanese family herself, she encouraged culture, education, and philanthropy, ensuring that Carlos balanced his business drive with an understanding of the world beyond profit margins. She would later become a silent pillar in his empire, supporting his ambitions but keeping the family grounded. Slim's early education was marked by a sharp intellect and an appetite for complex ideas. He studied civil engineering at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, but even here, he was different from his peers. Where others treated engineering as a purely technical discipline, Slim saw it as a blueprint for solving problems, whether in construction or in corporate strategy. By his early 20s, Slim had already gained a reputation in small business circles as a shrewd investor. His strategy was simple but effective. Find undervalued assets during economic downturns, buy them at a fraction of their worth, and hold them until the economy recovered. This mindset, part patience, part opportunism, would later become the backbone of his empire building approach. Mexico, in the 1952nd and 1962nd, was a nation in transition, industrializing rapidly but plagued by economic instability. To Slim, this wasn't a risk, it was an opportunity. The more chaotic the market, the better the deals to be found. And for a man who had grown up watching his father turn scarcity into abundance, chaos was just another form of raw material. It's in this crucible of immigrant resilience, personal loss, and an almost instinctive grasp of economics that the foundation of Carlos Slim's fortune was laid. Long before the monopoly accusations, long before the global headlines, Slim was just a young man with a ledger, a vision, and an unshakable belief that he could bend the rules of the market in his favor. Carlos Slim's rise was not the kind of overnight success that fills tabloid pages. It was the work of a relentless strategist who understood the rhythm of markets the way a seasoned chess player anticipates moves. By the late 1962nd, Slim had already established himself as a skilled dealmaker, running a stock brokerage firm called Inversora Burstil. But his ambitions were far greater than simply advising clients. He wanted to own pieces of the economy itself. The 1972nd were a turning point. Mexico was riding the waves of oil-driven growth, but instability lurked beneath the surface. When the oil boom went bust and the peso collapsed in the early 1982nd, panic gripped the business elite. Many were selling assets at fire sale prices, desperate for liquidity. Slim saw what others saw as disaster, a once-in-a-lifetime buying spree. This was when his empire truly began to take shape. He acquired companies across a dizzying array of sectors: tobacco, cigatam, insurance, Seguros de Mexico, manufacturing, mining, and retail. His philosophy was consistent: diversify widely, keep the core management intact, and improve efficiency without unnecessary showmanship. Slim didn't chase glamour brands, he chased businesses that generated steady cash flow. Then came the deal that would cement his legacy: Telmex. In 1990, during Mexico's wave of privatizations, Slim, alongside partners like France, TL.com, and Southwestern Bell, acquired the state-owned telecommunications giant. It was a bold and controversial move. The government was shedding public assets to stimulate private investment, but critics feared this would simply hand monopolies to wealthy insiders. In Telmex's case, those fears would prove prophetic. Slim understood that telecommunications wasn't just a utility, it was the backbone of modern commerce. Under his control, Telmex and later Telcel would dominate the Mexican market, expanding infrastructure but also charging rates that became infamous for their profitability. For years, Mexico's telecom industry was effectively synonymous with Carlos Slim. By the early 2002nd, Slim's reach extended far beyond Mexico. Through América Móvil, he pushed aggressively into Latin America, acquiring mobile operators from Brazil to Argentina, and eventually into the United States. He became a symbol of Latin American capitalism, proof that the region could produce not just billionaires, but global power players. At his peak in the early 2010 Slim's net worth hovered around $80 billion, making him the richest man in the world for several consecutive years, surpassing even Bill Gates. The Mexican press dubbed him El Ingeniero, the engineer, a nod to his academic training, but also to his meticulous, calculated approach to empire building. Media and society celebrated him as a national icon. He poured money into the Carlos Slim Foundation, funding health initiatives, education programs, and cultural projects like the Museo Sumaya, a stunning art museum in Mexico City that stands as both a public gift and a monument to his legacy. In public perception, he was both a shrewd tycoon and a patriotic benefactor. But success on this scale casts long shadows. As Slim's power grew, so did whispers of discontent. Competitors complained they couldn't enter the market. Consumers began to question why phone bills were so high in a country where wages were relatively low. And regulators started to wonder if one man could hold so much control without tilting the playing field entirely in his favor. What had begun as admiration for Mexico's most successful businessman was about to turn into a storm of criticism, investigations, and legal battles that would threaten to unravel decades of dominance. By the mid-2010 second, Carlos Slim was no longer just the pride of Mexico, he was also one of its most polarizing figures. For years, his critics had whispered about monopolistic practices, but now those whispers were thundering through the halls of government and splashing across global headlines. The core of the accusation was simple. Slim's companies, especially Telmex and Telcel, controlled so much of the telecommunications market that true competition was impossible. Mexico's Federal Telecommunications Institute revealed shocking numbers. Telmex held over 80% of the fixed-line market, and Telcel commanded around 70% of the mobile phone sector. These were not just big market shares, they were chokeholds. Competitors couldn't lower prices or improve services without being crushed by Slim's scale and influence. For the average Mexican, it meant paying some of the highest telecom rates in the world for service that lagged behind other countries. The political climate had shifted. Public patience for corporate dominance was running thin, and a new wave of reformers in Mexico's Congress saw in Slim the perfect target to prove they were serious about breaking monopolies. In 2014, sweeping telecom reforms were passed that directly challenged Slim's empire. They forced América Móvil to share its infrastructure with competitors and capped the rates it could charge other carriers for network access. It was a staggering blow, not just financially but symbolically. For the first time in decades, Slim's control over a vital industry was being pried open by law. His companies fought back with legal appeals and public relations campaigns, insisting they welcomed competition and that the reforms were politically motivated. But the narrative was shifting. The media, once eager to celebrate Slim as Mexico's genius businessman, now painted him as the face of economic inequality. International outlets ran features on how one man's dominance might have slowed Mexico's digital progress. Even fellow billionaires began weighing in, some discreetly criticizing Slim's old world approach to business in a digital age where collaboration and openness were becoming more valued. The personal cost was real too. Though Slim kept his private life guarded, insiders said the constant scrutiny and political attacks wore on him. Friends noticed he became more reclusive, avoiding certain public appearances and focusing more on his philanthropic ventures. But the monopoly label was stubborn. Every time his name appeared in the press, it was accompanied by that word. Still, Slim didn't crumble. In fact, his response was pure Carlos Slim: adapt strategically. He announced plans to sell off parts of his telecom assets in Mexico to comply with the new regulations, a move that was less a surrender and more a tactical retreat to keep the rest of his empire intact. But the myth of invincibility had been punctured. For decades, Carlos Slim had played the market like a master, always in control, always several moves ahead. Now, for the first time, the rules were being rewritten in ways that even he couldn't fully command. The question was no longer whether Slim could make money, that was a given, but whether he could maintain his grip on industries where governments and the public were demanding change. After the storm of telecom reforms and public backlash, Carlos Slim faced a new reality, an era where his once monopolistic empire had to coexist with competition and increased regulation. For a man who had built his fortune on control, this was both a challenge and an opportunity to redefine his legacy. Rather than retreating into silence, Slim quietly recalibrated his approach. He began diversifying his investments beyond telecommunications more aggressively than ever before. While still holding substantial stakes in America Amville, he shifted attention to sectors like infrastructure, real estate, and finance. His Grupo Carso conglomerate, which spans construction, retail, and energy, became a focal point for growth, reflecting a strategic pivot to balance out the losses in telecom dominance. Slim's public appearances became more rare, but his influence was far from diminished. Behind the scenes, he continued to wield considerable power in Mexico's economic and political spheres, often through personal relationships and discreet negotiations, rather than headline-grabbing declarations. The man who once ruled an empire of telephone lines was now a shadow king, pulling strings in quieter ways. Philanthropy took on renewed importance. The Carlos Slim Foundation ramped up efforts in health, education, and social programs across Latin America. The foundation's work during the COVID-19 pandemic, including funding vaccine research and distributing medical supplies, helped soften some of the public's harsher views of the billionaire. To many, Slim was no longer just the ruthless capitalist, but also a figure trying to give back to the communities his businesses had shaped. Yet, despite these shifts, Slim's life remained a study in contrasts. He maintained a reputation for frugality unusual for someone of his wealth, reportedly living modestly compared to other billionaires of his stature. No flashy yachts or extravagant parties, just a steady, unshowy commitment to his vision. But the telecom reforms were a stark reminder that even the most powerful can be vulnerable when public sentiment and government policy turn against them. Financially, Slim weathered the storm better than most predicted. America Melville remained a regional powerhouse, albeit a more cautious one, and his diversified portfolio cushioned any major losses. His continued success proved the resilience of his business acumen and the depth of his empire beyond just telecommunications. What surprised many was how Carlos Slim managed this new chapter, not with a roar but a whisper. Gone was the era of unchecked dominance. In its place was a more subtle, strategic presence, one that respected new market realities while quietly reinforcing his economic footprint. For a man who once seemed untouchable, this was not a defeat, but a transformation. Carlos Slim's empire isn't just about sprawling business holdings, it's also a family affair. Behind the scenes, Slim has cultivated a network of trusted relatives who play pivotal roles in managing his vast wealth, ensuring that his legacy will persist long after he steps back. Slim married Sumaya Domit in 1967, and their partnership was foundational not only personally but also professionally. Sumaya became a vital advisor and supporter, with the Museo Sumaya, named in her honor, symbolizing their shared commitment to culture and philanthropy. Though she passed away in 1999, her influence is deeply embedded in the family's ongoing ventures. The couple has 6 children, many of whom have taken up roles within the Slim empire. Notably, Carlos Slim Domit, the eldest son, serves as chairman of America Melville and has been groomed to steer the telecommunications legacy forward. His involvement signals a carefully planned succession, balancing the need for continuity with fresh perspectives to adapt to an evolving business landscape. Beyond telecommunications, Slim's offspring are active in various branches of the conglomerate, from construction to finance and philanthropy. The family governance structure is known for its tight control, emphasizing secrecy and loyalty, which has sometimes sparked rumors of internal power struggles, though none have ever surfaced publicly. Slim's approach to legacy is marked by a conservative but deliberate passing of the torch. Instead of public fanfare or sudden transitions, succession is gradual, involving long-term mentoring and alignment with his vision. This strategy aims to protect the empire from the fragmentation or dilution that can come with rapid leadership changes. Philanthropy also serves as a family pillar. The younger generation continues to promote causes championed by their father, investing heavily in education and social welfare, seeking to improve Mexico's future while enhancing the family's public image. Yet, questions remain. Will the next generation maintain Slim's hands-on approach, or will they steer the empire in new directions? As the global economy shifts and digital giants rise, the Slim heirs face the challenge of preserving relevance while innovating. For now, the family stands united, holding tight to the vast legacy Carlos Slim built, a legacy born of immigrant grit, relentless ambition, and a fierce desire to shape not just markets but a nation's destiny. Carlos Slim's name is etched deeply into the fabric of modern Mexico and Latin America, not just for the staggering wealth he amassed, but for the undeniable impact he had on industries, society, and how business is done in the region. His legacy is complicated, powerful, and still unfolding. In telecommunications, Slim revolutionized the market by transforming a struggling state-owned monopoly into a regional powerhouse. His investments expanded connectivity across Latin America, bringing phone and internet services to millions who previously had limited access. This expansion helped accelerate economic growth in many underserved areas, laying the groundwork for digital inclusion in emerging markets. Yet, this legacy is shadowed by controversy. Critics argue that his near monopolistic grip slowed competition and innovation, raising prices and limiting consumer choice. The telecom reforms enacted in Mexico during the 2010 second were a direct response to this imbalance, and many see them as a necessary step to modernize the sector beyond Slim's dominance. Beyond telecom, Slim's influence extends to infrastructure, retail, and finance, sectors that underpin Mexico's economic stability. His approach, rooted in disciplined investment and diversification, showed that a Mexican businessman could compete on the world stage with giants from the US, Europe, and Asia. Philanthropically, the Carlos Slim Foundation remains one of the largest and most active in Latin America. Its work in education, health, and culture, including initiatives to improve literacy, fund hospitals, and support the arts, has had tangible impacts on millions of lives. The Museo Sumaya, with its iconic architecture and world-class art collection, stands as a cultural beacon funded by Slim's fortune, symbolizing his desire to give back beyond the boardroom. For business leaders and successors, Slim's life offers lessons in patience, discipline, and the power of strategic risk-taking. His ability to identify undervalued assets, invest during downturns, and maintain long-term vision is often cited as a blueprint for sustainable wealth creation. At the same time, experts caution against the dangers of excessive concentration of economic power. Slim's story is often used in academic and policy discussions as a case study in balancing entrepreneurial success with the need for competitive markets and consumer protections. 2 decades from now, will Carlos Slim be remembered as Mexico's greatest industrialist or as the symbol of a monopolistic era that the country had to break free from? The answer is not simple. His story reflects the contradictions of emerging economies where opportunity and inequality often walk hand in hand. What is clear, however, is that Carlos Slim's influence will be felt for generations, not only in bank accounts or boardrooms, but in the very shape of Latin America's economic and social landscape. Carlos Slim's life is a study in extremes, a towering figure who rose from humble immigrant roots to command one of the largest business empires in the world. His story teaches us about ambition, vision, and the complexities of wielding enormous economic power in a rapidly changing world. He showed that relentless discipline and strategic patience could build wealth beyond imagination, even in environments fraught with uncertainty and upheaval. Yet, his career also reminds us of the dangers when one man's control becomes so vast it stifles competition and breeds public resentment. Slim's journey was not only about money, but about legacy, the legacy of a family, a nation, and a model of business that shaped Latin America's modern identity. His philanthropic efforts softened some critiques, showing a commitment to giving back, but the questions around market dominance and inequality remain part of his story. Ultimately, Carlos Slim's life is neither a simple legend of triumph nor a cautionary tale of excess. It is a nuanced portrait of power's price, the balance between innovation and monopoly, and the enduring challenge of legacy in a world that never stops evolving. If you found this story eye-opening, subscribe and stay tuned for more hidden truths from the world's richest.